Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud, with Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 25 of ProductivityCast. And so I just want to thank you all for listening to ProductivityCast, and I want to welcome to the show today Augusto Pinaud, Francis Wade, and Art Gelwicks. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Pleasure.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning,
How's everybody doing?
I'm doing really well, and as I was saying pre-show, I'm double caffeinated. I'm drinking 2 types of caffeine this morning, so I'm probably a little jittery. But I'm gonna try and keep it level for us all today. So we're gonna talk today about a rather interesting principle concept, centering on the premise of the getting things done, next action principles, and how those things change over time. And so I'm gonna hand the mic over to you, Augusto, to explain to the audience what we're going to be talking about today.
I was looking at my next action list as it was getting behind, and I couldn't understand why. It's not a matter of the job, it's not a matter of the task per se, but the fact was getting behind, and it's starting to get accumulated. So the question for me was, is this something because I've been extremely busy, or this is something because a condition around my day-to-day change? In my particular case was the second one, a condition around my workplace or my work day-to-day change. So what happened was I began changing or evolving my role from a person who spent a lot of time in the office to a person who spent almost none in the office. In other words, a road warrior again. As I was looking at that, I began to consider or ask myself if the way you see your next actions and how is affected by the unconscious time you think you have to accomplish them. So if you think, for example, on the 2-minute rule, 2 minutes without any doubt is an arbitrary number. So with practice, we begin to identify what kind of task can be done on that 2 minutes rule, in the same way that when we have less time, we change that 2 minutes to maybe a minute or 30 seconds and everything else go into the system. Or when we have a ridiculous amount of time, for example, a long plane trip coast to coast, then we can go to a 15-minute time because it will make no difference. We are not going anywhere. So I begin to wonder if on your next actions, you, conscious or unconscious, begin setting that same time. So when I'm sitting at work, this is around the time I can do without being interrupted or without the next meeting coming or without somebody coming to my desk and ask me what I'm doing. And you begin defining your next actions based on that interval. If that's true, then you should be able to adjust it one way or the other. But I'm curious if people also observe the same thing. In other words, if they also notice that their next actions are defined to a specific interval of time, or is just the way mine were set up.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of one of the questions that I always ask myself, and I ask other people when they're trying to do task estimation, is what's the amount of time that you think a task is going to take based on either assessment or historical values? What's important, I think, related to what you're bringing up, Augusto, is that I don't know that it's necessarily contextual to the time you have available, because if you think about traditional project management methodology, you've got time, cost, and scope. Well, if time becomes an inflexible value, which is this is the amount of time I have in my calendar, the only other 2 things that can adjust related to it are cost and scope. And if we're not talking about money, it's the amount of actual work that you can do. But we haven't said that's the case, that we can change the work on the task. So we have 2 inflexible values trying to help us do this assessment. I think if you're in a situation where you have time blocks and you're trying to find work that fits into those blocks, that's a determination you almost have to make prior to getting to those time blocks. You have to look at the timeline itself. You have to look at the tasks and say, okay, this task has traditionally taken 20 minutes. And I was reading an article last week, ironically enough, that talks about this idea of tagging related to time and going through and, for example, in this case, it was using OneNote, creating a series of tags, or I'm sorry, it was using Todoist. Creating a series of tags so that when you put a task in, you would tag it and say this is a 15-minute task or this is a 30-minute task. Then when you had those opportunities of planning your calendar, you could go back and say, okay, I've got 3 30-minute blocks here. Where are all my 30-minute tasks and what can I put in where? Theoretically, that looks solid. I have to admit, I haven't tried it that much hands-on in that method to see if it works well. But yeah, it has some pluses and minuses to it, but I think it's one of the ways to kind of mitigate this push-pull between time and scope when you're trying to get things planned out. I'm not sure if that's on target for what you're looking for, though.
I have a sort of a maybe a bit of background that may add something to the discussion, I think. It's a psychological phenomena from my point of view that when you create a task, the minute your mind comes up with a task, it automatically tags it in what I call in my book with implicit tags. And these have to do with, for example, what's the context, what's the duration, when am I going to do it, how important is it urgent, does it involve any equipment, does it have a cost? In other words, as soon as we create a task in our mind, these psychological tags get created along with it. When we start to bring tasks out of our head and put them onto lists, we start to make some of these tags explicit. So they go from being just sort of vague notions to being something that we can manipulate because there's actual data involved. So, for example, when you create a to-do list and you use the Eisenhower matrix, you're bringing the important and urgent tags out of your sort of the recesses of your mind, the implicit tags, and you're making them explicit because now you're organizing the tasks in front of you using these now explicit tags. And I think what happens over time, which I think sort of addresses Augusto's concern that he's noticed this shift, I think what happens over time is that as the number of tasks increase, we need to change our tactics accordingly. So in the very beginning, the first time we start to make lists, a lot of people rave about the Eisenhower list because it's a very basic way of using explicit tags. But that works for as long as it works, which is for most people up until the point where there's too many tasks. Then they need to migrate to a different kind of a system. And many people move to, for example, the GTD system, which is a system of using contexts in different ways. And the GTD contexts are a bit, how can I say, kind of idiosyncratic in a way, because some are location based, some are equipment based. Some people even use later, someday, so they're temporally based. So we try to gain some capacity by changing the way we tag. And I think what's happened with Augusto, my diagnosis, if I were a doctor, is to say that he's running out of available free time. And all of a sudden, he doesn't have the flexibility that he had. Or in other words, he has less slack time to decide what to do and to put tasks within the slack time that he has. So the amount of time has gone down, but he still expects his tasks to fit into the available slack time the way it used to, which is the system that he used to use before he went out on the road. And I think what needs to happen, sort of from the outside looking in, is he now needs to move to using temporal tags, which are duration, planned time of start, due date, and all that happens to all of us is that as we add more tasks, a new constraint emerges. So in the very beginning, when you're using memory, the constraint at that time, at some point when we maybe hit 15, 16, 17 years old, is that we can't remember all that we need to. So then we start writing stuff down. So at that point, the constraint is memory. And as we go along, the constraints change and we need to change our tactics accordingly. And I think he may be at the cusp, which many people reach from my point of view. And I've been there actually twice in my memory, where using task lists no longer works the way it used to. And I had to make a transition to scheduling everything, or in other words, time blocking everything, or using temporal tags instead of contextual tags. And the only reason I've survived the transition is because I use a program that allows me to reschedule my calendar without my doing it. In other words, it auto schedules my calendar. So it's perfect for someone who must use temporal tags versus other kinds of tags. So I've said a lot, but that's my sort of way of reading it.
Okay, I'm gonna agree with you completely on the idea of the temporal tags and kind of bring it down a notch, because I think you hit the key term on it, and that is the contingencies that are impacting the tasks have shifted. What are the primary drivers that have influence and control over those tasks? If you're in a situation where you have an 8-hour block of a day, and you know you always have that 8-hour block of a day, and you're going to be working in the same space with the same equipment and the same software, it's much easier to plan something that's going to flex. But if you're out and about, or you have hard schedule activities, or I'm going to flip this around a little bit, if you're a manager or an executive that has a lot of meetings that are thrown at you, not ones of your own creation, but ones that you keep getting invited to, then the situation you're in is you don't have control over a lot of those key drivers. So you have to say, okay, what are the influences that are going to mess these tasks up for me, and what actually items do I have control over? If you don't have control over the length and the spacing of your time blocks, then the only thing you can really do is chunk the tasks down in a way that they become much more dynamic. And that's where I start thinking about what we're dealing with here. I could see somebody who had a master listing of tasks, big tasks, and having problems scheduling them. Well, maybe they need to be smaller. Maybe need to have more little ones that can be broken up and fit into things. Now, there's a diminishing point of return there as well, where you're going to have so many little things to try and juggle that you may be transitioning in and out of work too quickly. It's not optimal in either situation if you don't have control over either the workload or the schedule. And if both are fairly out of your control, then it can be really difficult. That's where you have to constantly measure and evaluate your system. Look at the amount of stuff going in, do the work, look at how that work was successful. Take a look at those metrics and say, okay, what worked, what didn't? Did certain size time blocks I have a greater level of success, or smaller ones? And start to tune it and continue to refine it. I don't think you're going to find any one that you can flip a switch and this stuff is going to fit this particular model.
I very much believe in the concept of acceleration and deceleration lanes when it comes to your productivity routine. And so I think that's really important. I want to jump back to some comments that Francis had made about this being a memory limit issue. And if we can sort of think about this in terms of psychic RAM, I hate to really analogize the brain to a computer too much, but if we think about it from that perspective, we have this sense of psychic RAM, and that temporary memory storage does fill up very quickly for us. And so we need to be conscious of that. But there are other limits, I think, that also come into play, which, not necessarily limits, but other dimensions, which is the emotional dimension, typically measured in anxiety levels. And this is not really negative anxiety necessarily. It's just the discomfort you feel physically from the emotion of anxiety. And I think that a lot of people don't get that when we're talking about personal productivity, especially. Your individual anxiety levels will predispose you to a particular type of action or non-action, right? So that's one particular thing that we have to really take into account. And then as well as motivation, right? How motivated you are to do something or not will then also play into it. So I just wanted to add those maybe dimensions to the concept that, yes, we get to a point in our adolescent and then preteen and teen years where things start to become such a maximum limit that we can keep running in terms of projects and actions that we do start to keep lists. But then we get to this other point, which is that if I'm type A, I'm predisposed to higher levels of anxiety. Again, not necessarily a negative thing. We need to learn how to manage those well. And here in adulthood, we recognize, or we should recognize, I hope we recognize, that that's something that's going on under the hood, and we can then go ahead and say, okay, I need more framework, I need more control versus perspective, again, going back to sort of GTD language, in order to be able to reduce that stress and then increase the movement forward. On the flip side of this, going back to sort of the topic at hand, I did want to sort of outline a little bit about the way in which I approach this, which is that for many years, I have used time available as the driving force behind creating next actions, and not necessarily the traditional concept of context. I see the efficiencies of making calls together and sending emails together and so on and so forth, but that's just not how I work. I work very much project-based, and so there is this concept for me that I need to complete some chunk, what I call a milestone, which is either a part of a project or multiple projects together that create an anchor around something. And so many times I want to complete some part of something in order to feel accomplished. It's not literally just checking off one action for it that gets me that dopamine kick. It's the knowing of completion of something. So it's rather intuitive and iterative for me in terms of next action planning. And so over the years, I've just paid attention, and this, again, for me, I'm a quantified selfer, so I'm always tracking data about myself. And I've learned through past data how long it takes me on average, usually a mean average that I'm taking, not a modal average, because I think that can be a little less accurate than, for some reason, the mean average. And so I then go in and I identify how long things typically take for me, and thereby helping to inform me going forward when I look at how much time available I have and the actions that are necessary to bring me to fruition. Does that make sense, guys?
It does. It parallels, as I mentioned, the project management space. I look at things a little bit differently because I come from a pre-sales, sales kind of background for a long time, and a lot of it's estimation of work prior to doing it to get somebody to agree that you're going to do it. So for me, it's a matter of looking at historical completion, which is a lot of the measurements that you're talking about, and then being able to say, well, how close to that historical accuracy can we get in the estimation of this particular task to say it's going to take X number of hours to do. Now, that's on a larger scale, and not often are we thinking about things in just our daily activity where we're saying, oh, okay, this is going to be an 8-hour task or a 16-hour task. I mean, we break it down more granularly than that. Or at least I think we do. I know I do. So looking at that kind of pre-planning, I have to wonder, maybe to make it a little less daunting, maybe being able to break things down into buckets are helpful. Start to identify tasks with context, not so much around duration, but estimated size. This is a small task. This is a medium task. This is a large task. Understanding that that translates to roughly a half hour, roughly an hour, roughly 2 hours. And then you can go through and juggle your planning accordingly. I think a lot of this, honestly, from what I'm hearing from all of us, is going to be a lot of trial and error in methodology. I mean, that I've heard, there's no formulaic way to approach this, because it's going to vary depending on the type of work you're doing. And the one thing we haven't talked about, what happens when this planning breaks? What happens when something jumps into it? What happens when a task goes off the rails?
I can share some of my own history here. I recently, 2 years ago, made the switch from managing manipulating my own calendar. I mentioned using an auto scheduler before, and I've been manipulating my own calendar, or a calendar of all my tasks, for since about 2001, I think. And I had a break in between when I thought I could find something better, and turned out to be worse. But anyway, I've been trying to do this manually for 15 years. And then 2 years ago, I made the transition to using an auto scheduler. And I had the difficulty most people have, which is that it's hard to figure out the right calendar manually and to keep it updated. So Augusta is probably, looking at, I have 20 hours available each week that I'm not in meetings and I'm not traveling, and it's discretionary. I have 30 hours of activity to put into that 20 hours. How do I figure out what's the best 20 hours to pick from the 30? Now, doing that manually is very, 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 turns out to be very, very, very hard. I can say from experience, because you're juggling multiple attributes, figuring out what's high priority, what's urgent, and then that changes every day, and you got to redo your schedule whenever there's a surprise, and all of a sudden you have a late flight, and it messes everything up. And so you're always juggling and rescheduling, and you're doing it manually. You're trying to use a lot of psychic RAM, according to Ray, to try and come up with a schedule that looks feasible and have it be feasible all the time. When I started using an auto scheduler a couple of years ago, it took away all of the manual effort, because now with the click of a button, I instantly have an optimal schedule. But what I've noticed since then is that because I'm scheduling so frequently, which is multiple times a day, and I'm not using my own energy to do it, I've become a sort of a better scheduler, in the sense that I'm a better estimator. So I because I'm the lies that I used to tell myself and I used to get away with, this will only take an hour. Now I can see where that costs me something in my schedule. It costs me time and energy. So I've become a far better estimator, and I'm much less of a more truthful in how long things take, and how good I am, how well I can follow my own schedule. So of course I have history now, because the system gathers some data that you can go back and look at prior activities. I've become way more granular, as you could imagine, because when I did manual scheduling, and this was using a Google Calendar mostly, it was really hard to schedule a lot of items. So the smallest time block I could possibly manage was about a half an hour. I would never go lower than that, because it was just too hard to manipulate so many tasks. Now, however, I can go down to 5 and 10 minutes if I want, because I'm not the one doing all the hard work. It accumulates small tasks, put them together in different ways, and so it takes away all of the hard work. So I've become way more precise and more accurate, just because I'm less exhausted trying to keep up with my schedule of all my tasks. Something else is doing the hard work, and I've become way more smarter in the last couple of years, just because I'm preserving energy and putting it to where it's sort of, I guess, better used. It's my experience.
So it's interesting because the discussion, bring a bunch of interesting elements to consider. Years ago, when I was, well, almost as heavy road warrior as what um, my workload is turning right now to be, I consider a lot of those things. And when my roles change to a more fixed asset, and we're traveling now, was something that almost happened only for vacation instead of work, or constantly for work. The nature of how I classify and how I look into next actions and projects and other things uh, change with it. So it's quite interesting to look at it. I don't remember, and that doesn't mean that's how I may have done it unconsciously, to have a time bucket, for example. I was just have actions based on software, but or location, mostly software, because I said um, my role was heavy on the travel side. I was doing at that time over 250,000 miles in planes. So, but I had the things I have now that I mentioned that, I remembered. Yes, I had a certain list that were things to do on a planes, mostly because planes tend to be at that time longer working time. So maybe unconsciously, I was temporary tagging for time without necessarily being aware that is part of what is happening on this change towards the other side. When you change from being a road warrior and never have time to be on the office and have what seems like an unlimited supply of time, is not a problem. Turning the wheels, so going from the office to now this highly constrained working environment, it's what has thrown, at least mine, a wrench to my system, and made me consider where can be, or where are the potential elements that I'm ignoring and I'm not looking at, that are causing trouble.
I think it's really important here for us to identify for our audience what we can do to identify when things change. So that is to say, when is it appropriate for us to do that kind of review and reflection? What are the key indicators that tell us that something has shifted, and therefore time available, context, the length of time of particular next actions that you would do in one context, say sitting at your desk, now needs to be done, say, out in the field or on a plane, train, bus, what have you, and now cannot be done, or say you're driving, so no longer can you use that time, and that's something that has affected me quite greatly in the last year and a half. Is, I'm driving a lot more today than I used to, and that has fundamentally changed the way in which I get things done. So what are the things that you all sort of identify as those things, and how do you change with them? Francis, do you want to get started?
Yeah, funny enough, I've actually been thinking about this one. I'm writing an article about what you should pick as your next task manager, how to decide what your next task manager should be, which is very similar to what we're talking about here, which is when things change, how do you figure out what the next approach should be? And I came up with a calculator to try and figure out, okay, if you take this particular test, then it should tell you when you are ripe for a change. And I'll tell you some of the indicators I came up with. So one was the state of your email inbox. So if all of a sudden there is an overwhelming number of emails that you're not responding to in your inbox, or you used to be doing zero inbox and you're no longer doing it, then it's an indicator that something has changed and you need to change your system. And I'll give you a couple of the other ones. Feelings of overwhelm. As you look at your list, you have this sort of feeling of dread. It's an emotional measure. It's not, a practical measure. But another practical sort of measurable would be how many tasks are falling through the cracks. So how many are you just losing track of that you intended to do this week, or it had to be done this week? It had a very high intention and a consequence for not doing it, and you weren't able to do it, and the number of tasks that are falling through the cracks are increasing. So there's no system I know that actually measures that, and it would take a manual sort of recording of when that happens. But those are a couple that I've included in my calculator, which I can't recommend to anyone because it's so ugly. But anyway, that's a couple that I came up with.
Yeah, this is one of those tough ones, though, that each one of us is looking at it from a different perspective. I can understand why people get frustrated with this problem, because there are so many different ways to try and tackle it, and none of them have a clear endpoint as to, yes, this will work, or no, this is not going to work. I mean, I could really see... Okay, I'm going to kind of flip the equation here a little bit. What's the core problem? We've gone down a bunch of rabbit holes here, but I think we need to back up and go back to the original problem that we're trying to solve. So, Augusto, question for you. Based on everything that you've heard so far, has any of this actually addressed the core problem that you see?
As a person who, the short answer is no. But this has uncovered something quite interesting that you just mentioned. The problem has been poorly stated, and that is a possibility. Or the simple answer to this is a lot more complex than what even I was estimating. That is exactly part of the reason I wanted to bring this topic to the show, because changing on your work conditions internally, even with and without a promotion, they happen to everybody who is doing the system. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion on the topic, and trust me, I searched for it. Okay, but this happened to everybody. Okay, you start doing this, and hey, things change, life change, work change, travel change, everything else change. So, but as we have been, or I've been noticing on this discussion, there is, as you said, not a clean cut, not a clean answer, and not a straight path. That then make me think on how on the level of frustration for the people who is going through that, okay, who not necessarily have the time or have spent or have the passion to look and research and look into the little details of all this. They just need something that work and will allow them to move from the place they are stuck to the place they need to go. And that has been a really, really interesting thing.
I think I see a common problem though. The challenge that the individual faces is that what my habits, the combination of habits, practices, apps, tools, devices, the little system I have for myself has stopped working. There are symptoms that are showing up that I never used to experience before. So let's say they're unwanted symptoms. So everyone gets to that point at different times of their life. Some people react by just cutting down the number of tasks and saying, you know what, I've had people tell me, I don't want to get promoted because I know I can't handle it. So I just want to stay at the level I'm at until I retire. So they're essentially saying, I don't want life to give me any more triggers for me to create any more tasks than I can currently manage, because I can't manage more than the number that I have. But most people respond by saying, how do I get rid of these symptoms? No, the short answer is, you need to change the combination of habits, practices, tools, and apps that you're currently using. And you need to upgrade them accordingly so that you can manage more tasks and thereby get rid of these unwanted symptoms. The tougher question is, which ones do I change? And am I sure those are the right ones for me to change? But the common problem is common, even if whether you're 12 years old or 50 years old, whether you're a CEO or an entry level employee. The question is, how do I change these things that I use so that I can capture more capacity and get rid of these symptoms so I can move to the next level? And I've focused a lot of times in my own sort of research and writing in figuring out what that ladder of skills needs to look like, as long as it's only about the tasks increasing, not about the emotional pressure or the anxiety or any of that. But if it's just about tasks increasing, then there's a ladder that we tend to climb as humans that I think is predictable. The challenge is that most people aren't aware that they have their own system. Most people aren't aware that it's made up of habits, practices, apps, devices, tools. Most people aren't aware that there is a ladder and the need to upgrade. Most people aren't aware of any of those elements. And when they're not aware, then it's just a matter of chasing down the latest blog post. And that's when it gets really difficult for them. That's sort of my take on it. They don't see the common problem.
So let me ask a question then, and I'll go back to you, Augusto, and ask the question this way. If somebody came to you with this problem, how would you recommend to them that they start to tackle it? Take yourself out of your own shoes and look at it from the outside.
I don't know Augusto's system well enough to be able to tell him, but I could suggest ways in which he could sort of measure the unwanted symptoms, the degree to which he has them, and then figure out where he is on basically the ladder, and then make a choice as to what the next rung on the ladder should be in terms of the tool, habit, practice, that combination. So I'd give him some kind of way to self-diagnose himself and then look at the next level and then choose it or not.
That's how I approach this problem when it was identified. Fine. Then now it's time that I sit myself on the patient chair and look at it. And that was how there was a couple of things. One is, what are the new constraints that you can see? Because as much as we all will love to see all the constraints with clarity, that doesn't mean it happens. So now that you are going to be this, one is, what are the constraints? Second, what are the times that has been changed? So for example, time in the office versus time in the car. Now I'm spending a lot more time in the car. Therefore, I need to make sure that if there is anything that can be done productively while I am in the car, for example, making a phone call, I have a clear and simple and complete access to be able to get those phone calls, or as many of those as possible. Um, that bring you back even to equipment. Am I equipped enough to have a good phone conversation in the car? Because if nothing worse than have the conversation and then the person on the other side is hearing all the noise and everything else. So all that things come into play. Third is, okay, now if you are now into all these meetings that are at the end of the work and you're traveling and spending this amount in the car, how much time you have left? Because that is the other point. If you are on the office environment where your supply is pretty much unlimited and you are now not, well, then that is. And the other element is, how fast are you consuming energy and how can you replenish that in a faster way? And what I mean with that is, when you are, again, in the office most of the time, you can manage how much energy you are consuming. When you are now meeting to meeting, get in the car, drive an hour, go to two meetings, get in the car, drive another hour, go to a meeting, it gets more challenging to manage energy, mostly even in the best of your abilities, you are now running almost all the time. That said, there are things you can do to try to slow down, to try to recover energy, and to continue doing some of the good stuff you used to do before. So at this particular point, for me, has been a more exploratory process than a solution. Hence the reason I wanted to make this call, to see if there was a clear answer or elements that I was missing on the assessment I was doing. Interestingly enough, it wasn't. It seems that part of the answer, it's more complicated than the simple I seems to show.
I wanted to spend a little bit of time here just doubling back on the part of the discussion we were talking about with regard to how to identify when it's time to actually look at your system, to identify whether or not you're creating the right next actions appropriate to the new potential contexts of your life. Context being not just GTD context, but really, what's happening? What's the circumstance of life? And so there is, in psychology, something called the Holmes-Ray life stress inventory, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes. And what it does is it uses 43 different units to identify whether or not you are having major life stress or not, and it uses a point scale and so on and so forth. That's really used for whether or not you're going to have a mental or physical health breakdown, right? Some level of trauma happening in your life, and therefore you need to address that health risk. I like to look at it from the perspective that those are opportunities whenever any of those things happen to assess your system. Is my system appropriate to the circumstances of life right now, and life and work? And so I have just 15 categories that cover these things, and I'll copy these into the show notes so you have them, but I just wanted to list them off here really quickly so people are aware of them. The first one is birth, second is death. So whenever you have a birth or death in the family, that's really a time to take assessment to whether or not you have prioritized the right things, but also, are you setting up actions appropriate to the time now you have available to you. Professional transitions, and those include demotion, promotion, being hired, being terminated in some way, shape, or form, whether involuntary or by choice, changes in careers, that is switching and transitioning from one career to another, starting school, first job, moving home, moving offices, downsizing homes, starting retirement for some people, marriage or some type of long-term commitment has been engaged, and then any time of long-term commitment ends, whether that be through divorce, separation, or ending a long-term relationship. So those are the 15 of them that really are the questions I actually ask clients all the time, especially if they're experiencing some level of trauma, to say, hey, that is trauma to their productivity system, not necessarily mental emotional trauma, but are these major life events happening? And if they are, then we need to reassess the system. Francis?
Those are really cool. I'll share my calculator in the show notes as well. It'll be finished by the time the show actually comes out, but I could share for some of the others I've looked at. How often do you wish you had more spare time? How often does the thought come up? Do you run late for meetings and appointments? It's sort of a basic one. Are you meeting your due dates? Do you have a good reputation, or has your reputation been suffering lately for being and delivering on time? Are people telling you that you have a problem? I also added on something about space and saying my personal space has piles, so I can't find stuff when I need it. Is that a factor, or has that increased lately? And then maybe the last one I'll share here is, I'm awakened in the middle of the night by the thought of a task I forgot about. So that's sort of a jumping out of your sleep in a panic, wondering if that happens, that's probably not a good idea, a good indicator that it's time for you to look at your blend of practices, habits, tools, and apps.
Remarkably, I've never been awakened by my own thoughts in sleep. I'm a fairly light and sensitive sleeper, so I'm awoken by many different things, but be they sound or light, things happening in my environment. But I am a sound sleeper otherwise.
You've been spared.
Maybe that's a testament to my productivity system. Yeah, maybe that's a testament to my productivity system.
I think in a situation like this one, more information is needed before decisions start getting made as to how to make changes. So my recommendation to you, Augusto, is to take a deeper dive into what's not working, what's failing, what is causing stress and agita. Try to isolate those items and then tackle those, because right now this sounds like a really big pizza to eat, and you need to get it down into some smaller slices.
I agree, and I think there are many people, most people, who struggle in the same way, especially people who are sort of productivity smart, because they can't understand why the system they have put together all of a sudden doesn't work. And it's not, oftentimes they try to work their system even harder, or they try to follow their same approach with more rigor or more discipline or more energy or more something. And it's frustrating when that doesn't work and they're not able to see the far bigger picture, that it has to do with capacity. And capacity is no respecter of the system that you use. At some point, we all run out of capacity just because we keep creating more tasks. So it's almost like an inevitable must happen in the life of all of us. The question is, where can they find the targeted support that goes beyond the top 10 list or here, read this book? And I think the self-diagnosis, self-evaluation is a critical part of that.
Well, I, for one, no, I don't have a definite answer to the problem, but I'm really happy of the discussion, because one of the things that has been frustrating to a point is how many directions this problem seems to turn and how many heads it shows. In a way, it's like fighting with a hydra. You cut two heads and say, great, I'm moving forward, and suddenly you now have four heads in front of you. You're like, oops. This is not going in the direction I was planning. But the discussion shows that it's not necessarily a single cut answer, and it may require even going to a more basic level than what I originally thought.
Well, gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. I want to thank you all for always joining us here for this ProductivityCast. If you, our listeners, have questions or comments, please go to productivitycast.net/contact and leave us a message. You can record an audio message and potentially be here on the show with us, or write a message and hit submit, and we will try to answer your question either here on air or in and via messaging back and forth. So feel free to go to productivitycast.net/contact and let us know. Also, please feel free to rate us on iTunes or your favorite podcast directory, wherever you access ProductivityCast. Please do rate us. That helps to broaden our reach and therefore expand the ProductivityCast community. And we want to spread this far and wide and bring more people to it. So please do that. And as well, you can feel free to share your favorite episode of ProductivityCast so far. Feel free to share that on social media and let us know why that episode meant as much as it did to you. That would be really great for us to know. We really appreciate and enjoy the feedback. Finally, thanks to Augusto Pinaud, Francis Wade, and Art Gelwicks. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on ProductivityCast with me today.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Here's to your productive life, everybody. Take care.
That's it for this ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud, with Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks.